This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Chemed Health. Chemed is dedicated to providing exceptional healthcare services to the Lakewood community. Their team of highly skilled doctors, nurses, and medical professionals work tirelessly to ensure the community receives the very best care possible. Their state-of-the-art facilities enable them to deliver advanced medical care that is second to none. As the Lakewood community continues to grow, Chemed is looking to expand its team of physicians and nurses. To hear more, reach out to Yari Stern at 973-800-4235 or at Stern, that's YSTERN, at chemedhealth.org. CHEMEDHEALTH.org. This information will be in the show's notes as well. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode of the podcast, please reach out to me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, as well as if you would like to just support the podcast in any way. There's a PayPal link in the show's notes. You can also Chase, QuickPay /Zelle, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Also, if you can subscribe where you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, 24/6. You can please subscribe there and also rate it on Apple. If you can rate and review, very much appreciate that. And as well as any feedback you have. This episode with Dr. Sclar about the ongoing Rambam exhibit at the YU Museum is very, very interesting. The exhibit, if you're in the New York area and you want to check out something on Rambam over the summer, it'll actually be going until December, but as you'll hear, there's certain items, the Rambam's own handwriting will be leaving back to Oxford in mid-September, so you can check that out. Also, if you're interested in hiring Dr. Sclar for a private tour of the exhibit, as he's the curator, you can reach out to me, email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. I can put you in touch with him. And enjoy the episode on Rambam. I think this is the first dedicated episode on Rambam. There's a lot more to go. This is really based also on a collection and an exhibit and that kind of thing. But enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. David Sclar, who, as listeners will be familiar, wrote his dissertation on the Ramchal. We've discussed, as a Jewish historian, but for purposes of this episode, he's also a curator of the ongoing exhibit on the Rambam, Maimonides, at the Yeshiva University Museum, and he is also the author/editor of a accompanying volume titled The Golden Path, Maimonides Across 8 Centuries, which has a extensive catalog on the holdings of the Hartman family, who we'll discuss, and what's in the exhibit that Dr. Sclar put together, as well as an edited volume. There's a collection of articles and essays about the Rambam. So thank you, Dr. Sclar, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
So as I mentioned in the intro there, listeners are familiar with you and your work on the Ramchal. We did 2 episodes on Ramchal. Rambam is a bit different from Ramchal. So how do you get to Rambam?
Okay, so the story goes back about 15 years. When I was in graduate school, even really before I was getting into Ramchal, I worked in the library, the special collections of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Now, this is the greatest Judaica collection that's ever been assembled. While I was there, I worked with readers when they came in. This was special collections, so I was able to see this amazing stuff. I worked with readers, I did cataloging, and I also curated exhibitions, and completely got involved in manuscripts and rare books. And there was a private collector. His name is Robert Hartman. He lives in Chicago. He is singularly focused on the Rambam and sort of lives according to his understanding of the Rambam. And basically, he was collecting, and he was looking for somebody to catalog his collection, and not just like a basic rare book cataloging, which can get technical and involves what's called paleography and codicology when it comes to books and manuscripts. But he wanted context for each of these items. He wanted to understand basically the way it was put to me was stories. And he got my name through a dealer, and I started cataloging sort of one by one. And by the time I was done with the bulk of his collection, which included 50 or 60 items, I think I had something like a catalog of 200 pages. And I said to him then, and this is again, that by then, when it took me a few years, I had finished, or I was working in earnest, writing my dissertation on Ramchal. I had done all of this work, and I asked him if he wanted to have an exhibition and publish the catalog, and he wasn't ready. And then the summer before COVID, he reached out to me and said, and I was always in touch with him and, sort of working with him every year, but he reached out and said that he was ready to do it. And we went to the Yeshiva University Museum. And various things happened with certain people getting involved. Current director Gabe Goldstein was brought on as project director. He wasn't working. He used to work for Yum, and then he came in. Anyway, this exhibition turned into, rather than just a Hartman focused exhibition, basically the goal was to use this exhibition to use the Hartman collection as the core of a much larger show that involves the Rambam and his impact over from the moment of his life, from his lifetime until today. And that basically meant getting manuscripts and books from institutions all over the world. And so I'm not a Rambam scholar, but I got to this because of my work with manuscripts and rare books. And then the exhibition basically moved forward, and then we produced a book as well, which consists of two parts. One involving this catalog that I rewrote everything from what I had originally written, and a second section that consists of 11 essays from scholars, wonderful scholars, some of whom you've had in the show, from all over the world.
So a bunch of things to follow up on, but let's start with, so just librarian, probably on the first episode we did on Ramchal, you probably mentioned this, but you just mentioned there. So besides for being a historian, you're also a librarian. You kind of do both.
Yeah, I mean, my day job, I work at Frisch, the Frisch School, Yeshivat Frisch in Paramus, New Jersey, and I teach history there, and I'm also the librarian. I am not a trained librarian in the sense of having a Master of Library Information Science. Like I didn't go to library school. But I worked for 7 years in the special collections of JTS, and then I continuously was cataloging. I've done a lot of book stuff and a lot of rare book work. And now I work in a school where I'm a librarian for high school kids, for teenagers who don't even necessarily, sometimes they'll come in and say, why are there books here? The work I did for Hartman was sort of the combination of things, of taking my interest and my abilities as a historian, my previous abilities in curating exhibitions, and in writing and in editing, and sort of putting all these things together. I don't really consider myself to be, a librarian per se, because there are excellent librarians in the world who know much more about that and think as librarians. And I tend to think only, as best I can in whatever I do with bringing these things together.
So you mentioned the Hartman and their interest and his interest in Rambam, but you could talk a little bit more. I mean, why specifically do you have more to say about why specifically his interest in Rambam came about? And that kind of was the, impetus for this exhibit, even though there are other things here which we'll discuss, like Rambam's own handwriting and other things that he doesn't have and that come from other libraries that are now displayed. But he's the one behind the
So I'll do my best to speak for Bob. So basically, he wrote a preface for the book in which he described his journey. And when he was in his 30s and 40s, he was starting to question exactly how to meld, almost like, as the Rambam would put this, like, almost to meld what we would regard as philosophy and commitment to the Torah, whether you want to consider science and religion, or however you want to put all of this. So he turned to the Rambam, and he saw something that made sense to him in terms of harmony and balance and commitment. And so he became singularly focused on the Rambam. As far as the collecting concerned, it started with one thing, one manuscript, which is in the exhibition, which is it appears in the catalog also. It's a Moreh Nevuchim that was produced in this, certainly the second half of the 15th century, towards the later 15th century in Italy. And he just became enamored with it. And the feel, for those of your listeners who have ever had any contact with rare material, and I'm not talking about something that's 100 years old, although 100 years old, something 20 years old could be rare. Something now could be rare. But the point of an object that's been around for hundreds of years, that has its own story, it has a feel, it has a smell, it means something. There's a lot that it can evoke when, if you're sensitive to this kind of thing, and especially if you have an understanding and appreciation for what the history can actually be and what this book has actually, quote unquote, seen, or at least where it's traveled, what it's represented. And Bob felt that with that particular book, and then continuously. So, for instance, he's got a 2-volume set of a Mishneh Torah that was printed in Venice in 1550 that includes notes. Many older books have lots and lots of notes, not just Haggadah, but like notes in what's called the fly leaves, these empty the blank pages in the beginning and end of a book that are coming from ownership inscriptions. Now, he's got this one particular one that was owned by an Italian family called, their last name was Sigin, and they had it for 200 years, and they included all notices of births and deaths and other family events, but plague and robberies and tragedies and things like this. And it speaks a lot to what the family is. And that's one of Bob's really favorite pieces that he has, because I think it represents something about his own life and his own family's life. And there's something special for collectors out there, when you feel that connection to the past, through a particular object.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk about it in the catalog in the book, and I assume it's in the exhibit, right? So all these items that
yes,
we're in the exhibit. Okay, so
almost everything in the catalog is in the exhibit. There were a few things that I wrote about anyway that we didn't ultimately, because it's really two different jobs, two different projects, two different, like what an exhibition is and what you want to convey and how you convey it is a much more immersive experience in terms of like visually and in terms of presentation. The book itself is also visual. It's also presented in a particular way, but you immerse yourself intellectually because you're reading and using the pictures. It's a whole other story when you're dealing with an exhibition and also trying to reach a larger audience.
Yeah, I should mention the book for a minute here. The book is paperback, but it is a large size book. It's not your regular size. It's a tall book, and it's full of color photos. I mean, there's just many, many, many pictures together with the articles. I think the book is around 250 pages, and it's $39. So yes, it's paperback. It's not hardcover, we'll say, but it's a big book with color pictures and glossy pages. So it's a very high quality production and is pretty affordable for that.
It's great. It was published by Liverpool University Press, and they were fantastic. Just taking the design is fantastic, and I think we have 130 photos in the book. So yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, it's really nice. So we'll work through. I think we'll go through the way you do it in the catalog, and you can talk about. We'll kind of reference both the items. We'll go through some of the Rambam, not some of. We'll try to go through all of the Rambam Sfarim / manuscripts. Then you'll talk about what's in the Hartman collection, what's in the exhibit, and just in general the printing history. There's just a lot there to talk about Rambam. Recently, on an episode on the Spain series that I did with your friend Professor Mark Hartman, I think I mentioned how I haven't done an episode on Rambam, which is really odd, but Rambam really deserves his own series. But this is kind of the first standalone Rambam episode. By the way, I don't think we mentioned that the Rambam's bio, but I guess, I don't know if we should, but he lived in the 12th century, mainly, died in the early 13th century, right, goes from Spain, ends up in Egypt, but we'll mention him throughout. And it's not a Rambam specific episode to like his life, but more about... But
we can, if you want, I can run through it very, very quickly. So the Rambam, he lived between 1138 and 1204. If your listeners right now Google the Rambam, the vast majority of references to when he was born will say 1135. The reason scholarship is so important is because it's been more recent determined, in the last several decades, that he was actually born in 1138, not 1135, and it takes quite a while until such knowledge makes it mainstream. So he was born in Cordoba, which is in Spain. His family went to Fez, in modern-day Morocco, with the Almohad invasion. There seems to be quite the possibility, if not certainly that the Rambam converted to Islam, that he and his family converted to Islam in order to actually continue living, meaning to save their lives. That gets to a complicated thing, and I'll leave that to Rambam scholars, including you mentioned Mark Herman. So Mark has a very interesting and very important way of looking at what that conversion potentially just meant, which is essentially he was just trying to save his life, and then he moved on. And then eventually he left Fez, made his way to Eretz Yisrael, to Akko, but not for long, possibly only 5 months or so, and then ultimately landed in Fustat, which is sort of old Cairo. Now it's subsumed within Cairo, in Egypt. And he was there between probably around 1168 until his death in 1204. You could have a whole series on the Rambam, so I could just leave it at saying that there is no one like the Rambam in Jewish history, and a singular individual in virtually every way. And what the exhibition deals with is what is this impact of this person who, in his own time, he was this obviously a dayan, a revolutionary thinker in terms of halakha, just the production of the Mishnah Torah, but he's also revolutionary in every other way, and what Moreh Nevuchim represents in terms of philosophy and what he's going for. But he also was a communal leader, completely invested and completely devoted in that sense. So we have Geniza fragments, and some of which are in the exhibition, showing clearly about representing his role as a communal leader. But you can go on and on and on about the Rambam, and so that's the point of the exhibition. Ultimately, what his impact ultimately was until where we are today. But anyway, we can get there if you want.
I mean, he's just such a fascinating figure in the Jewish world, being one of the Gedolei Rishonim, still studied and learned in Yeshiva and Halacha all over till today, as well as a philosopher. And then the non-Jewish world, everyone knows Maimonides as a philosopher, as his medical works and everything else. I mean, Moshe ad Moshe lekam Moshe. I mean, everyone, he's just such an amazing and important figure. And as you say, he's one of the Rishonim that, we always learn Rambam, we hear about Rambam, and you can go to the exhibit and you can see his own handwriting very vaguely. People think of Ksav Yad of the Rashba. I don't think we have any manuscripts of the Rashba, but the Rambam, you have his handwriting. It says Moshe ben Ramaim, and it's there. You can actually see his own thing, which kind of gives you this kind of connection when you just learn Rambam all day, and he's, died over 800 years ago, and you're like, wait, we actually can see what he wrote. He actually wrote this letter. This is his.
It's amazing, and it's not. I mean, we do have his actual signature, but it's even beyond the signature. When you see the signature, it's sort of like, okay, this person has now come to life for me. But there's even more, because the Rambam is so important, intellectually speaking and culturally. There are Geniza fragments where you have drafts, let's say of the Mishnah Torah, which we have including, or of some tshuva, it's there in the exhibition as an example, so anybody could see this. But the point that you see that he's editing his own work is huge, and then you can start to think, if you really want to get into the learning of it, what is he changing and why? And the question of why is a hard one to follow. But certainly, what is he changing, and how do you trace it before he ultimately has some sort of fixed text? And that's where the Cairo Geniza is so amazing. And there are regularly, we have dozens of material from the Rambam himself in his own handwriting. And even until today, there are fragments that are now being determined are from the Rambam that we didn't know about previously. So for instance, some of your listeners may have heard from a few months ago that there was a fragment discovered in Cambridge by Jose Martinez Delgado. He wrote about it, I think, with Amir Ashur, who is an Israeli scholar who really is spearheading, Rambam autograph scholarship. They discovered something that's basically a glossary or something, trying to figure out exactly what this material is. The Rambam's got some sort of romance language and it goes through a series of definitions of something. I mean, it's amazing that there's still that's one thing, that the Cairo Geniza itself is a never-ending font of material, but including with the Rambam. And then once you have that, you can really try and engage with who the person was himself. It's not then it becomes even more interesting and three-dimensional in essence when you try to consider what the learning is, what is the voice that's actually being presented here, how has this changed, how did this person develop over time. And you mentioned the Rashba, we don't have anything from Rashi, Like everybody feels attached to Rashi. For those of us who are Sephardic, there might be a greater attachment to the Rambam, but it's quite a thing to be able to see something from that particular individual. Anyway.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that. I do want to mention something, because we'll talk about the purported conversion. So it's not clear. This was mentioned on some previous episodes, and I did get some feedback. People were not happy about that comment. So first of all, it's in line with the Rambam's own psak about converting to Islam to save a life. That's, first of all, should be very clear. But second of all, it's not my understanding. I'm going to leave this also to the academics talk, but I don't think it's clear that he did or didn't. I think it's Muslim sources mention it that he did. But as a friend of mine put it, someone put it to me, but that could be also, it's always everyone wants to claim a great person as one of their own. So I don't know how accurate that is or isn't. I'm not here to say yes or no. Like you said, we'll leave it for the Rambam.
You're right. It's a good point. It is from a Muslim source. And there are lots of ways to address that. And again, we can leave it for somebody else.
Yeah, I just want to mention it. Once it came up in the past. That's where it comes from. And yes, no, whatever. Again, it's definitely in line with his psak. If there was a lot going on at that time, I think in Morocco there was radical Muslims out to and there were forced conversion and killing. So it was a very dangerous time to be a Jew, and there was there's what more to go on historically. But let's turn more to the catalog. So the catalog, the beginning of the book here, and we'll talk. You can talk about the exhibit as well. Is the catalog of the Hartman collection, and then comes the essays, and then will come some other materials that are in the exhibit. But the order of the catalog, and we can kind of discuss this here on the podcast, the order is not the order of when the Rambam wrote his Sfarim. It's the order of, I guess, chronological order of the Hartman collection. So the first item you have Izamar Nevuchim with some other things, and that's because I guess that's the oldest manuscript in the Hartman collection, so that's where you start.
Correct. So, for instance, we know that the Rambam wrote a commentary on, or started writing a commentary on the Talmud, and when he was very young, and we have Milot HaYikayon, which is this treatise on logic, also when he was written when he was young. But instead of dealing with it in a chronology of authorship, we're dealing with what's the chronology of the objects themselves. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the Hartman collection itself is absolutely fantastic. Meaning, we have this exhibition. It's a fantastic exhibition. The material that we got, it's the core of it is the Hartman collection, and then we have all of this these objects that are from various institutions, including from Oxford, where you have autographed manuscripts from Rambam, from the National Library of Israel. There's a beautiful illuminated manuscript from the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen. Now, I don't think that there's maybe there are 3 institutions in the world that could produce a Rambam story, a Rambam exhibition like this, meaning maybe JTS in New York, maybe the National Library in Israel, and maybe the Bodleian, just on them by themselves, could tell this 800-year story. But mostly institutions could not. You could have, certain places that have these beautiful manuscripts or something that's particularly important. But the goal of the exhibition was to use the Hartman collection to tell this story of the Rambam and his impact. And the situation here is it's not an exhibition like on the Rambam per se, just himself in his own time. That's one particular section. It's also not just an exhibition that is manuscripts and books, because there's other material. In a way, what we're doing is using the Rambam with the Hartman collection as the core to tell, as a conduit, to tell a story of Jewish life over 800 years. And it's not just Jewish life, but really to tell a story of 800 years. And there are not many figures, could maybe use Rashi, but probably not even. The Rambam is ever present, so to speak. Like he just is, especially because he was so prolific and because he was so diverse. And so we're able to take it through all the various changes in the early modern period into the modern period, the various views of Maimonides, the fragmentation, the compartmentalization of Maimonides, all of this, to tell the story of Jewish life over 800 years. And so for the book, we did a similar thing where it's following the story of these 800 years rather than imagining, we're going to break it into different sections. between like these are the legal works, these are halachic works, these are the philosophical works, these are physician medical works. We didn't do any of that. It's really just to tell a chronological story.
Right, and Rambam really one of the most wide-ranging, I guess, prolific Rishonim.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, Rabbi Shekol Yisrael. Rashi has, who doesn't learn Rashi on Chumash and Nach and Gemara, but it's different. It's really mainly commentaries, Chuvas, whatever, some other things. But the Rambam is just between Halacha and Pirush Mishnayos, and then Moreh Nevuchim and medical works and logic, Milas Egayin. It's all over, and it's such important Svarim. So let's talk about I don't know how you want to go in order. Obviously, you have the first thing I mentioned is, and let's talk about the exhibit entries, and you can pick one specifically if you want to just to explain this. But how you go through in the beginning, you talk about Moreh Nevuchim, and each one you have kind of almost it's in catalog entry, but it's not like a boring, if the listener's thinking of a catalog, like a couple of lines, like this volume, this many folios, this many. It's not like a boring. There's a whole write up here with color pictures of those items. So what do you do? Just explain like in the catalog. Each item that you go through, what do you write up?
Okay, so the goal here was to make this bibliographically sound, like significant to bibliographers, of which there might be one or two listening to this ever. There are not that many out there. And then also relevant to scholars of particular areas. And then most importantly, in my opinion, most just accessible to as wide a range of an audience as possible. So that means if you start with a manuscript, you take the manuscript and you deal even with just physical characteristics. So you're going to measure it. The measurements actually matter, and so they're included in this, like in sort of at the top. You're obviously stating what the title is. Now that can get complicated. What sort of title are we talking about? Where do the titles come from? Moreh Nevuchim is not the title of the Rambam, because he wrote in Judeo-Arabic. It's not something we should have mentioned this before. Almost everything that the Rambam wrote was in Judeo-Arabic. Judeo-Arabic meaning essentially the Arabic language in Hebrew characters with Hebrew words occasionally in there. So Yiddish is you can almost refer to it as Judeo-German or Ladino, like Judeo-Spanish. So that idea. So there's a different, you have different titles, but anyway, you start with a title. And in this case, you also included a translation and and then there's got to be consistency throughout. Where is this manuscript from? Do we have what's called a colophon? A colophon would be frequently or usually at the very end of the manuscript, and that indicates from the scribe that maybe they'll mention their name, maybe they mention where they were writing, when, what the date is, who they were, if they're a professional scribe, who commissioned it, that sort of thing. If it's not, then we date it and localize it as generally as possible. So this thing might be from Provence, if we don't know exactly where, for Provence in 14th century. So he's got, for instance, the Hartmans have a Pirkei Moshe, which is the aphorisms of Moses, meaning these medical texts, and it was written in Provence in the 14th century. Sometimes you can localize it even further, and so these are technical issues. Then the job is basically, as I looked at this, it was to say, okay, this is the first time that we're mentioning Moreh Nevuchim, or the first time we're mentioning Mishneh Torah. So I've got to discuss what exactly this is and try to make it interesting. Then discuss something more specific, meaning what if we're talking about Provence, we're talking about Yemen, we're talking about Italy. Why is this relevant? Why is this there at this particular time? What's going on at that time? Sometimes there are then additional notes or inscriptions, like I mentioned earlier, but you'll have just a single line of something in whatever particular language it may be. And if it's possible to transcribe it, then you can determine actually that there's some relevance to it. And what does it mean? So then you tell some particular story about this. Now, you could go on and on and on. Like we're really talking about lives of books. And when we're talking about something that's been around for 600 years, and especially if it has lots of inscriptions, and we're talking about some cases, famous, you'll find famous names. Like there's a book that was owned by Shmuel Salant, or Samson Raphael Hirsch, or famous printer named Avram Pescarol. Like there's a story to tell, which each of these things, sometimes you don't know anything about these things, or very, very little, and then you got to go and find, the work of somebody who's an expert in one particular thing, and then go deal with that bibliographic work and ultimately try to make this particularly relevant. And so trying to find some small place in Yemen as an example, but again, trying to make this all both relevant to scholars but also ultimately interesting to a wide public. So that's ultimately what this is. And we did the same thing with the essays. Like, the goal with the essays was not to be technical as much as to ask for 2,000 word essays about, let's say, the Rambam in science or Rambam in medicine as a particular thing, or Daniel Aster, who you might have had, I think, at one point, the Rambam in Karaites. So he gave an overview in a few pages. Now he could write a book probably just on the Rambam in Karaites. But the point here is to make this both interesting, new, and accessible.
Yeah, and I very much enjoyed. I read through the entire catalog, the catalog part, and I really enjoyed it. But I am somewhat of a book geek nerd, so I guess I'm someone that likes it. But it is very informative. I think if you don't know about the Rambam Svarim enough, basically you read through the catalog, you'll see the pictures, you'll really learn about the Rambam Svarim, and then manuscripts and printing, and you'll also learn a lot about obviously the items themselves. As you said, you go through the stories. You mentioned the Katzigan family and that edition of the Rambam. There's all those interesting things about each of these specific items more than the Rambam. But if you want to just mention some of the Rambam Svarim, we can discuss. Obviously, as you mentioned, we forgot to mention, you wrote in Judeo-Arabic. That's the Moreh Nevuchim and the Pirush Mishnayos and some others. But he did write Mishnah Torah. Sefer Mitzvahs was written in Hebrew. We can talk about those. Milas HaGayon you mentioned. Then there's Shuvas from him, which Shalos Shuvas. There's letters. There's his medical works. There's others. And then also in here, we should mention as well that you include together with the Rambam's works is things very related to the Rambam. Hasagas HaRavid. So the Ravid's famous questions on Rambam in Mishnah Torah. That's part of the Rambam. There's some other Svarim. There's things on the Ramah. There's things on, you have things on others related to the Rambam. You'll say for others. So you can, I don't know where we want to go or how much we should discuss of all the Rambam's different works, because it's endless and we can be here for hours. Really have to go see the exhibit or read the catalog. But if you have anything in particular that jumps out that you wanted to mention.
It really is endless. The goal here, like I mentioned before, was to use the Hartman collection, sort of keeping my feet on the ground here and keeping anybody who wanted to read this. And walking a path. The title of the book is The Golden Path, and the title of the exhibition is The Golden Path, Maimonides across 8 centuries. You could do this in 50 different ways, probably. But the point was to use these and to walk through 800 years, this particular story. In a way, you could say, for each of these objects, there's something similar. Like, it could have one particular thing. Why did it survive and something else didn't survive? In the exhibition, for instance, there's a piece that was loaned by the National Library of Israel that used to belong to the Hartman collection, but the Hartmans donated a bunch of fragments to the National Library. But we brought this particular piece back. It's a single folio, meaning one page, front and back, so to speak, or a bifolio. Sorry, it's 2 pages. That of a Maggid Mishnah, written. It's a manuscript in the 15th century. So this particular piece, it could be like nondescript. It doesn't have to mean anything to most people, except that if you start to consider, okay, here's a manuscript. This is a commentary on the Rambam. The text itself is not going to be necessarily unusual, but there aren't that many manuscripts of the Maggid Mishnah that exist in the first case. Certainly not 15th century manuscripts. Then you have a situation that it's just a fragment, and when you look at it closely, you actually see that there are various creases in it, and it looks kind of interesting. Why are there creases? Because this particular fragment that was written on parchment survived the confiscations and burnings. Well, it didn't survive the confiscations, but it survived the burnings of the Talmud and other rabbinic works in Italy in the 16th century, of which there are other representations and other discussions of this also. And this particular piece survived, as in it was on parchment, and it could be used. Church authorities determined that you can just use these fragments for basically binding other books, books that are printed in Latin or in vernacular languages. And so we mentioned the Geniza before. There's the Cairo Geniza, but there European scholars are referring to a quote unquote European Geniza, which is essentially thousands of books in European libraries that the texts themselves are not related to Jews, or they're in Latin or vernacular languages having nothing to do with Jews. But there are bindings that are these volumes are bound with these parchment texts that were rabbinic texts, and this is one example of that. So that's something that survived. We have the innumerable examples that we can't even fathom of what didn't survive over these centuries of Jewish travels, sometimes travails. And so in a way, what the book is, and the exhibition, is just walking a particular path based on what the Hartmans have collected over 30 years. And that's why I was saying you could do this in any possible, any number of ways. And so there are lots of stories. I guess one thing I didn't mention is that the whole point, from the very beginning, from what the Hartmans wanted from me when I started working when I was still in graduate school, was basically a story of what this object is. And so it's, to your point, to your question about what exactly appears in this book and what's the what are in these entries, there is all the material that's important bibliographically. There is the Rambam connected stuff. There is the ownership piece, but then each of these, there is a particular story. So, for instance, the Katzigan volumes that I mentioned, where this family kept these records for 200 years, that is from a massive 2-volume Mishnah Torah that was printed in Venice in 1550. Now, there was a rival edition. This famous story about rival editions between the Giustiniani and Bragadini editions, where the Maharam of Padua, Meir Katzenellenbogen, had written a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, and he wanted to print it. Anyway, he took one to, I'm going to forget which one's which. I think he went to Giustiniani first. Giustiniani is famous because he was neither Giustiniani or Bragadini were Jewish. So Giustiniani is known, though, for having he was finishing his complete edition of the Talmud, and he was including indices that are still used today that became extremely important. Mesurat Shas is an example. Anyway, Katzenellenbogen took his commentary to Giustiniani, and they were going to print it, and then they had a falling out. So then Katzenellenbogen said, "Forget this, I'm taking this to Bragadini." But Giustiniani went ahead and printed it anyway. And then they had these rival editions, and there was an issue of copyright. And Katzenellenbogen wasn't happy about it. He wrote to the Ramah. Ramah was very young at the time. An issue of banning one of them. But the issue really became that this precipitated a larger problem of how the church was dealing with the Talmud, and specifically just generally rabbinic texts. And so within a couple of years, there were confiscations of the Talmud and other rabbinic texts. And by rabbinic, I mean anything that surrounds the Talmud. Talmud is just sort of a word that was, you could use, but we're talking about Hilchot Arif and anything, things that we don't even know about necessarily. And so these rival editions of the Mishnah Torah printed in Venice in 1550 and 1551 led to basically where the Giustiniani and Bragadini presses got lawyers about this issue of copyright, and the church officials basically said they could care less about the actual copyright issue, and they ultimately used this to announce a whole program that would involve confiscations and ultimately burnings of the Talmud in Rome and in Venice in 1553 and 1554, and then centuries of censorship. And itself is this massive story. So basically that, I did my best to tell that story, which in a few pages of a description of those particular books. There are others. There's one that actually I've written an article that I don't know when it'll come out, but about one particular thing. It was like a detective story for me. In Venice in 1665, there was a small printer named Domenico Bedellago, and he printed a sefer Mada, Ahava, and Zmanim, so from the Mishnah Torah, the first 3 books of the Mishnah Torah. He printed those 3, unlike the Giustiniani and Bragadini editions that I just mentioned, which are massive and have all of these commentaries. the Vitalago imprint that had just these first three books of Mishnah Torah have no commentaries to speak of. It reflected, and it's a smaller book. It's not a pocket edition exactly, but it's small. And it reflected the period of time when, in the mid 17th century, when there was a growing readership and printers were issuing texts, including their editions of the Talmud, without commentary. It sort of goes back to the Maharal saying, like, you need to actually learn the material itself before you move on to the commentaries. Anyway, so Vitalago printed this particular book. It's interesting in itself, but the real thing that is sort of mind-blowing when you look at it, that's certainly eye-catching, is that the title page looks very odd. And there's a picture of this in the catalog. Basically the text block for what the title is shifted down towards the bottom of the page. So, anybody who's going to grab a book, you're going to see usually the title is going to be at the top, if not in the middle, or towards the, a third at the top. And we're talking about being centered in some way. This is very odd. It's moved down, and at the very top of it, there's an engraving that was plastered on. It was like clearly added later, but at the time of the printing, of a man riding a lion. Now, this is 1665. You had a whole series on Shabtai Tzvi. Some of your readers may recall, if this came up, I'm not sure if it did actually, that there was a process of how Shabtai sort of the supposed messiahship was announced. He announced himself or pronounced himself as a Messiah in 1648, but he continued going on, and it really only came out in the autumn of 1665. And it came with basically his relationship with Nathan of Gaza, and then Nathan sends these letters out. He sent to one particular person, Raphael Yosef, who's in Alexandria. Anyway, Nathan was describing what the Messianic era is going to look like in the coming years. And in a few years, you're going to find that, and he mentions this guy named Shabtai Tzvi, and in a few years, you're going to find that Shabtai is going to be riding on a fire-breathing lion with the reins of a seven-headed snake. And I think he describes it, he's going to be marching ahead of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, something like that. Anyway, the whole point here is that the Messiah is supposed to be arriving on a lion. And here you have an example of somebody essentially precipitating this or announcing. This is the first printed reference to Shabtai Tzvi. Now, this had been known. There are a few catalogs that refer to this, and a couple of articles that have seen that refer to this particular image, although it's not very well known, but it's known to bibliographers. The work that I did, though, because of the point of trying to make this relevant in a larger historical sense, was to try and figure out exactly what was going on here, because this was printed in June, and was supposedly Nathan doesn't send out his letters until September or October. And this is what's going to be in this article, but basically what I refer to here is that Vitalago, in that summer, he had a few books that he printed with references to Shabtai. And it's a real immediate, enthusiastic response to the arrival of the Messiah, so to speak. This is long before anything that we would consider to be Sabbatianism. It's just a guy in Venice who's excited, and there's a lot then to think about what it means when the Jews are awaiting the Messiah. And so, back to your question about what from before, really, about how did I write each of these entries. The point here is, yes, it's Rambam connected. Yes, there's the bibliographic element, but the larger and more important issue, and this is why it's supposed to be accessible to everybody as best I can make it, is to find the historical relevance. And so, and each of these objects has a story to tell. This is one of the more fantastic ones, and the other one, regarding the Bragadini and Giustiniani editions, is probably the most significant. But really, every single one. I mean, you've got manuscripts from Yemen that are fascinating, that they might look sort of not particularly interesting, and then you start looking at I don't even mean inscriptions, the way something is written. There's one example of the Rambam's commentary in the Mishnah, that is written in a very careful way, in a very interesting way, that I realized it was written in Yemen around 1600. Now, printing never made its way there was no Hebrew printing in Yemen, although Jews were active printers all over the world. And we might think that Yemen is like, the far reaches of the Jewish world. Well, not necessarily. In the medieval period, certainly not. And it's an important stop between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And it's clear that there are Jews coming and going and connected to the Jews of Yemen to communities all over the place. Anyway, there's two particular manuscripts, but one that I noticed and show with images in the catalog, that this particularly beautifully done Perush HaMishnayot, handwritten, was based on a printed edition, copied exactly from this printed edition from Bamberg in Venice, several decades earlier. And that itself then becomes a larger story about how did it get there? Who is the scribe? What is he going for with each of these things? And that's something, I think, going back all the way to the very beginning of when we were talking about, how how Bob got into this. It's that you can feel these things, that each object has a massive story to tell.
Yeah, really fascinating. The Shabtai Tzvi related Rambam. That's on page 95 of the catalog. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of Yemenite ones. Temani, the Rambam was big in Yemen. This thing's owned by the Kafech, Yosef Kafech, and his grandfather Yichya Kafech. There's a lot of, or Kapach, as everyone familiar with them. There's also Svarim related to Rambam, as you mentioned. I see here, I'm flipping through like Mishnah and others. And the last item, there's 38 kind of, I won't call them entries. They're not small entries. They're big. Some of them are a bunch of pages long of your kind of catalog entries. The last one is on Chaim Brisker. That's in here. Brisker Rav, you mentioned Brisker Rav in there. So that's in here as well. Things related to the Rambam that are very important today, right? In every yeshiva, everyone learns Reb Chaim. So written on Rambam. And there's just a lot here. So it's really, really fascinating. So let's turn a little bit let's discuss the essays a little bit. There's a number of essays in here. And put together by a bunch of authors. By the way, I don't know, you should have included maybe that article that you're talking about with the Shabtai Tzvi in the essays, but I guess it's too loosely.
No. That was something I wrote while I was doing this. The whole point with getting the essays was to have scholars who are really experts in their field deal with the Rambam and something, whatever it may be, that correlates to material that is in the collection. So, it gives context. It gives, even more context than what I was doing with the catalog. Most of the scholars, I've known well, in some cases going back, from even when I was working at JTS. That's how I mentioned Danny Lasker as an example. I first met him when I was working there, even in the early years of when I was in graduate school and working in JTS. So basically, there are 11 of these essays. So I'll just run through them quickly. And they're all excellent. And your listeners will know many, if not most, of these names. So Tzvi Langerman wrote on Maimonides and what he calls anecdotal evidence in medicine and science. Yosef Tobi wrote on Maimonides and the Jews of Yemen. Yosef Tobi is a really world-renowned expert on the Jews of Yemen. Ephraim Kannervogel, who you've had many times, wrote on called his on the citation of Maimonides in medieval Ashkenaz. Evelyn Cohen, who's an art historian, really one of the world's experts on Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. She specifically, her specific essay is on illuminating Maimonides, or illuminations and illustrations of the Moreh Nevuchim in manuscripts from the medieval period and the Renaissance. Now, that all really that precipitated this whole idea that I would ask lots of scholars for these things, because it's using, we have lots of illuminated Mishnah Torahs that exist, Renaissance era especially, but The Moreh Nevuchim, not necessarily. And you can even consider, like, why would somebody, a wealthy patron even ask for anybody, any of your listeners who really try to work with Moreh Nevuchim? I mean, you're in trouble when the Rambam starts by saying, once you think you understand something, you know that you haven't understood it. So it's not frequently illuminated or illustrated. And Evelyn Cohen used one of actually that first manuscript that the Hartmans bought, that Bob was offered 30 years ago. This Italian late 15th century manuscript has this illustration of Maseh Merkavah, which is also interesting halachically speaking as to whether, there's all these discussions as to whether you would do such a thing or not. Can you illustrate Maseh Merkavah or not? The Ezekiel's chariot. So anyway, so that's another essay that's from Evelyn Cohen. Ted Fram has an essay on the reception of the Mishnah Torah in the 16th century. Then Daniel Asker, who I mentioned before, he did the Maimonides and the Karaites. Joanna Weinberg, who I think also was on your podcast, her essays on Christian readers of Maimonides in medieval and early modern Europe, because that's a whole story in itself that is dealt with in both the catalog in terms of Christian appreciation of the Rambam, but it's also dealt with in the exhibition, because there are pieces that we have you might have something from the Rambam that was translated into Latin as an example, but we even have something in the exhibition from Isaac Newton in his own hand, where Newton, as far as we know, Newton used the Rambam twice, or in two instances. One, he was working on reforming the calendar, and so he looked to the Rambam's the laws of the new moon. And then there was another instance where he looked at the Rambam's descriptions of Mishnah Torah of the dimensions of the temple, of Solomon's temple, because Newton also was a deeply religious person who saw that the Solomon's temple, it basically represented the cosmos. So anyway, so Joanna Weinberg wrote about Christian readers of Maimonides. Roni Weinstein was a wonderful scholar also. He wrote about Maimonides as a Kabbalist. And there's books about this. There's something in the catalog about that as well. Irina Zwiep, a Dutch scholar. I don't know if you've ever had Irina, but she's fantastic. Maimonides and the Modern Jewish Mind. This deals with Maimonides and not just modernity, but also sort of uses of Maimonides and appreciation of Maimonides and study of Maimonides, academically speaking, in the 19th century, because we have material about that as well. There's something, the famous and hugely influential Jewish bibliographer and historian Marit Steinschneider. There's a manuscript from him that was actually not in his hand, although his notes are there. He had hired somebody in Oxford to copy a medieval manuscript that's still in Oxford, still at the Bodleian, and send it to him in Germany. So there's that from Irina Zwiep. Mark Shapiro has something on Maimonides and Orthodox Judaism. And then the final essay is from Maya Kirsky-Katz, Maimonides and Popular Culture, which is the longest essay and absolutely fantastic. Has something like 40 images where she deals with Maimonides and the image, and as she said, popular culture, and it's fascinating bringing it all the way to where we are today. And so the essays themselves also follow a chronology, so to speak, each corresponding, generally speaking, to the pieces, to the issues that are raised in the catalog.
Yeah, the last essay is interesting. She talks about Maimonides and popular culture and goes through, I think that's the one where she discusses the picture, right? The famous picture of the statue. Yeah, I have a friend in Lakewood who's an artist, Izzy Babad, and he was painting, he wanted to paint a picture of Rambam recently, a couple of months ago, and he did. He reached out to me before the book came out. He was reaching out to me about, the accuracy of the picture and the statue, and he ended up going to some sort of blended something. I sent him, like, you must read this. You need to check this out.
So Maya pointed out in the article that it's based on this earliest reference that when we have this book in the exhibition, printed in Venice in 1744, this massive tome of sort of exploration of Jewish antiquity, and the author of the book says, well, this portrait, which is like the standard portrait of, you think of the Rambam, a man with a beard, with a turban, with a robe. he says, "Oh, it's based on this old medallion. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that, but we don't have an actual picture of the Rambam." But
Yeah, you talk about the Shmuel Regio, Yashar, famous
yeah,
Maskell, was involved with this as well. And yeah, but it's very interesting to see the article. You see him on, Israeli dollar bills. You see him on an ad for Post cereal in the forward in the 30s. You
oh,
see
it's
him on
fantastic. Yeah.
stamps. You see him with graffiti, some really cool graffiti with that picture of the Rambam. You see him, all over stamps, statue, one in Cordoba. And I mean, just it's very, very interesting article. And, there's some interesting essays there as well. Now,
Right.
and the last part, after the essays, you talk about the additional exhibition loans, where we mentioned a number of autographs, a number of illuminated manuscripts, there's some other things. How'd you go? What was that? I don't know if there's, first of all, you can mention any interesting, things that jumped out that we didn't mention. And also, what was the process? Like, were you involved with that, getting those items? Like, how'd you pick what to get from which libraries or museums or collections?
So I curated the exhibition. I mentioned that I'd been working with the Hartman collection for a long time. When it became clear that the YU Museum, this was all really COVID time, so it became clear, okay, the YU Museum would commit to this, having an exhibition with me as curator, but things got delayed. They brought in Gabe Goldstein, who I mentioned before, who's now the director of the museum. He had previously worked there as a curator, and he was consulting elsewhere he was gone for about 12 years. When he arrived, we had a meeting and he said, okay, let's make this, like, think of anything you want and let's go for it. So there was already a no-brainer with one thing, which was that the YU Museum is an owner, along with what's called the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, of a panel of a door from an Aron HaKodesh from the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat. So in other words, it's perfect. It's been on display before at the YU Museum, but it actually is something that the Rambam, in theory, would have seen before. The Ben Ezra Synagogue, it's even better, because it's the Ben Ezra Synagogue was where the Cairo Geniza, where the Geniza was discovered. So that was clear from the beginning. I didn't even know that they had it, or if I had known when I was, previously, I had completely forgotten. So Gabe, that was clear. That's going to be there. Then I started thinking, okay, well, there are two manuscripts in the Bodleian that we must have. Autograph manuscripts. Then thinking of fragments that are at JTS. And then some illuminated manuscripts. And then those are sort of like the heavy hitters. And then the issue is how, we're telling a story here. The Rambam through 800 years. And like I mentioned, the Hartman collection being the core can keep my feet on the ground, but then I have to be able to think creatively, and also, like, you have to think in terms of sections for the exhibition, and then subsections and cases. And the point is to make this cohesive and palatable and ultimately user friendly. So that takes time, and the technicalities, it gets complicated. I dealt with the side of, what did I want, and then writing letters and and that sort of thing. And then the people at the museum, were the ones who dealt really with the technical side of things.
Right. There's art. There's Hotel Maimonides key fob from Cordoba. There's amulets. I mean,
the final section in the exhibition, there's a final section which is like this repository of where we are today. So you mentioned that there's the Rambam on the shekel bill, right? And stamps and medals or medallions, but really, it became even more interesting. Like it became clear to me that this last wall can be the sort of thing that we just put everything that of how expansive the Rambam's impact is, including today. So there's a basketball jersey from Maimonides School in Brookline, Massachusetts. There's stuff from Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. For those of for baseball fans, there's a Brooklyn Cyclones play. The minor league team plays in Maimonides Park, which is based on Maimonides, the medical center, but there's a T-shirt there that shows the field, and it says Maimonides Park. There's a onesie, there's buttons and magnets and graphic novels and wine bottles and a mortar and pestle and mugs and because we're and phone cases. I mean, where we are today, it's like Maimonides is everywhere. And now this final wall where we're showing all these things that are, sort of removal of, from the sublime. It's very different to think of the Rambam when you first come in and you see the Torah Ark door, this panel door from the Aron HaKodesh in the Ben Ezra synagogue, and you see the Rambam's autographs, which is his time, who he was in his own time. And you run through hundreds of years of Jewish history and all of these, what this material is, and then you get to where we are today, where things are compartmentalized and random, but the Rambam is ever present, so to speak. In that sense, this last group of stuff really should be able to reach anybody. So.
Do you also have the new editions of Rambam Sfarim? I mean, the endless new editions of Rambam Sfarim.
No, we didn't put anything there. Nothing like that. Yeah, I mean, it is endless.
Yeah. Okay. Oh well. Okay. So let's talk about just so first of all, the book, which we discuss a lot of, there'll be a link in the show's notes. Anyone interested can purchase. And like I said, it's on Amazon. It's really, it's like $39.99, the full price, and it's really, I mean, you get a real quality work for that with endless color pictures. Really interesting. It's a great. It's not expensive. But let's talk about the exhibit. How can people go to the exhibit? When is it open until? What are the hours? What's the story of that?
So it's at the Yeshiva University Museum in Manhattan. That's at the Center for Jewish History on 16th Street, between 5th and 6th Avenue. They are open. You should look online. I know that they're open on Sunday, and then Thursday evenings. I think they're open until 7:30. It's on view. It opened at the very beginning of May, and it's on view through December. I would recommend, however, to your viewers, if it's possible, that they go sometime in the next few weeks, because the two most important Rambam manuscripts, in my opinion, which we have from the Bodleian libraries in Oxford, are only going to be in the exhibition for basically until mid-September. These two manuscripts are one, which is the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, of which there's a companion volume in the National Library of Israel, and scholars frequently have said that this is the Rambam's autograph, meaning that he wrote this. It's unclear to me whether he wrote all of it, or certainly the notes on the side are in his hand. This is extremely important, and it's open to a famous page. The famous page is of a menorah that has straight arms, which, of course, your listeners will probably be aware of the straight arm menorahs or Chanukiot that are all over the world with Chabad. The Lubavitcher Rebbe regarded, okay, this is exactly what the Rambam wanted. There's a whole, you could have scholars talk about exactly what this, what the issues were surrounding this, but in any event, this picture is there. It's really fantastic to see. And the other manuscript, also from the Bodleian, in the same case that has to go back, is a Mishnah Torah that was written by a professional scribe that has the signature of the Rambam. And he says, Hugam Misifri Ani Moshe Rabbi Maimon Zal, referring to his father. And the Huga, meaning proofread, but also it seems to be with like an authenticating or authorizing this copied edition. So both of these manuscripts are absolutely amazing to see, and we're very, very fortunate to have gotten them, but they're going to be on view only until mid-September. If you miss them, you still have other manuscripts, Geniza fragments from the Rambam and his signature and otherwise, and then of course the rest of the exhibition, which each of these pieces, as I've tried to impart, are important for each of their own reasons, in which case the exhibition is running and through the end of December.
So I'll include the link on YU's site for it. But what they're saying here, exhibition hours, it's 5 days a week, Monday through Wednesday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Thursday is 10 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. and then Sundays 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And they have other hours available by appointment. There's an email contact. I'll put that in there as well. You can check it out. How are you still affiliated giving tours? How does it work? How does that work?
I mean, sometimes shuls are contacting me. I'm giving a tour on this coming Sunday, and I've done that. But yeah, so if you want, they can reach out to you, and then if they want to contact me about giving tours.
If anyone is looking for a private tour, basically, reach out to email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. I'll put them in touch with you if they're really interested. Okay, so that's it's a very fascinating exhibit. I hope to make it over. As you can tell from this, I have not made it there yet. I hope to. I have not, but I did check out the book, which is really interesting. So again, I'll include the link to that and the link to the YU Museum site, and listeners can check that out. And thank you, Dr. Sclar, for joining me once again.
Thank you.